Hey everyone, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4.2 demo for the piece I call Sephiroth. Now I'm a little bit under the weather, but I'm going to try and do this video as best I can. My nose is a little stuffed, so I apologize if I sound a little weird. But anyways, I think the thing that most people are going to be curious about regarding this Sephiroth illustration is why I stylized him in the way that I did. And I think the sketch phase is a good time to be talking about that. So, as you can see, he's not stylized in a normal way that one would stylize Sephiroth. I mean, even myself, my natural inclination would maybe be to have him look a little bit more like he does, more of that anime pretty boy kind of look that he has. And I'm a big fan of the character. I'm a huge fan of Final Fantasy VII. So it wasn't that I necessarily changed him out of any kind of disrespect, like I did the Squall piece that I did years ago that was just sort of for fun to piss off like hardcore Squall fans. This was really just, I wanted to do something fun with him, really is all it was. I think that it's kind of easy to go straight to representing him like he does, and I've certainly sketched him that way in the past and just never really taken him to a paint or any type of colors because I knew that it just wasn't anything special. So I wanted to do something where I was using shapes that I would normally use in other illustrations, but I would try to apply it to Sephiroth. Now as far as the process goes for this one, it's slightly different than some of my other ones. So you can see I did an incredibly rough sketch, which I do whenever I know I'm going to paint and render something. It's always rougher because I have to I want to solve less things so that can come out in the paint. But then what you'll see here is I actually take his like head and his one bang, I guess you could say, all the way to full render so that I can test out a lot of what I want to do across the rest of it, and then I just eventually expand to the rest of it. Now, another thing stylistically that he has going for him is, Sephiroth is always depicted with these like super lush anime eyes with these really long eyelashes, and I still wanted to capture that here. So he's got his eyelashes are like completely overdone, but then a lot of his other features are more sort of, I guess, like westernized. He's got the bigger jaw with the bigger cheekbones instead of going for like the more rounded shape, at least the more rounded shape that Sephiroth has, because even when he's rendered in high fidelity for something like Advent Children, he still has like a little bit of that roundness to his face, to smooth out that bottom edge and give him more of a little bit of a pointy chin, but not pointy like this, not like a big pointy thing, more like a casual point, I guess you could say. Now, even though this is a fairly simplistic painting from the standpoint of it's just a bust, there were lots of elements with like his coat and his shoulder pads and all that, so I did run into some layer management issues, especially because sometimes or frequently, I guess, I like to keep the face layers separate from like the neck layers so that I could do some stuff there. So this file from a layer management point of view had just some interesting things. For instance, instead of flattening out major parts of it at once, since I did the head first, I had like the skin layers all in their own set of layers and folders, and then the hair in their own, and the eyebrows in their own, the eyes, and all that. And then when I expanded him further and added more hair and his chest and then like his coat and all that kind of stuff, I had to come up with ways to, I guess, sort of expand the folder system without it just being like a straight add, because I still had things that I needed to keep separate. And that sounds really complicated the way that I'm wording it, and it's kind of complicated in practice, but if you were to just look at it, it was simply a matter of I got to a certain point with my layers, brought certain things to sort of like near finished quality, and then had to add more to that from the same, I guess you could say, like base materials or sort of like source forms. And so by doing that, it was just a bit of a balancing act on like what layers do what and stuff. So as for his skin tone here, you can see all the layers right there, the colors, not only because you just watched me add them, but right there where his ear and part of his face is under his hair, that's like my base skin tone right there. and then I went up in values. You could see right there was a subtle brightening to his skin, and that's because, you know, Sephiroth is usually depicted as fairly pale, and even though I had him on the pale side, I wanted to bring him a little paler still. So now after we've got all those base layers, and then we add that palifying layer, which was like a white set to overlay, and then like a really low opacity on that. Then we go in and do the blush, the darkening around the eyes, and then the lips, and all these are done with like either a regular layer with a lowered opacity, like such as the blush, or like the darkening in the eyes and the lips and stuff, which was a multiply, like a very light gray multiply. You'll also notice I did something slightly different here. He himself, his skin is sort of just painted neutrally. It's like the diffuse, or you could say like the occlusion pass. And then I have a multiply layer on top of that for the cast shadows. And that was just a methodology that I wanted to try out across the entire thing. So you'll see me be lighting things somewhat neutrally. I mean, there's a little bit of a direction to them, but anything that I'm determining is like a cast shadow, I'm saving for a multiply layer that will get added later. You're probably wondering why everything turned off there for a second. It's because I wanted to go in and make an adjustment of some sort. And now here I'm just putting in some of that subsurface scattering that happens with where the shadow and the light meet. Now we're working on the eyebrow. Unfortunately, it's a little on the low res side, meaning the actual video. The piece is high res, but a detail like the eyebrow in such a, I don't know, where it's so insignificant on the page is just kind of a little hard to see. But you can see me putting in those little lines, and then I go in and put a little bit of highlighting, and then that's pretty simple in the grand scheme of this piece. I was particularly happy with the way the eyes came out, simply because if you played the Final Fantasy VII anthology or series or whatever they're calling that these days, people from Soldier, the group that Sephiroth is from, like everybody's always remarking on their eyes, and Sephiroth specifically has these like cat eyes, and I just thought that they came out pretty nice in this piece. If I were going to call out some things to note here, it's the way the shadows cast, I think, came out pretty nicely. Also, you can see a little bit of bounce light on his eye from his skin, just a little bit of reflection there. And then we've got like the hard shine, and then I have like a little bit of hard shininess going on with like the tip of his nose and on his eyelid and on his lips and on his upper lip. And that's just to try and like push some extra depth and give some extra texture and material information to what you're seeing there. Okay, so now we've got the face basically done, everything that I want to prove out at this stage, and now I'm going in and doing the hair. In an effort, of course, to organize my layers the way I do, that big plane of hair coming down is on a layer, and then the plane that represents the hair going upward is also on a layer. That way I can just paint that under one. You just saw me flick it on and off. That way I can paint that under one like you see I'm doing right there. I can paint all of it the way I want it to, and then I'm not having to be mindful of the top plane. Now eventually all of this will just get merged, because it's I gotta save layers and it becomes sort of like complete and I can move on from that. But for now it's all separate, so I can do what I want with it. An interesting thing to note here is the way that I paint that upward going hair. I don't actually like it, and when I did it I was like, yeah, sure, I think this might be the way that I do it, and it's admittedly a little closer to the way that it might be depicted in something like Advent Children. But then when I get to doing the big hair planes and some of the other bits of hair, I sort of go stylistically differently, and I like it a lot more. So I'll go back in and repaint this in a minute. Or not in a minute, actually. It comes way later, so not in a minute. Forget what I said. So now that the under hair is basically done, we're going to move into the top big fat plane. To some degree, this will represent me then testing everything that I want to test before I move into saying like, yeah, okay, this is all working out. Let's go across the entire piece and do this. So here I'm just doing the edging of it to give it some depth so that it actually is like thick. And then I'll start going in and doing more of like the surface like you see right here. So first I'm just using lines to sort of block in where I want the smaller forms of hair. So it's like you've got your big plane of hair, and then these are like the subplanes, and then now I'm going in and just much more softly sculpting it and adding the softer shadows where I want the form to turn, and like a harder shadow if it's cast or if it's receding. So you can already see with this hair that it's going in a very different direction stylistically than that hair that's underneath. I think I was just sort of happy to get that underneath hair done, and I was like, my brain was just like, yeah, it's done, like ignore it, ignore it, ignore it. And so that's when I moved on and just started doing the rest of the piece. And then later I just sort of like came near, like passed over it, probably zoomed in or something, and was like, this needs to change. So right now we're just modeling out the rest of the hair, and then we're going to enter the stage where I decide to finally tackle the rest of the piece. I didn't exactly know what my background was going to be at this point, but I had an idea that I would probably stick him. I mean, I was totally stick him somewhere like dark, just because I thought that was going to make sense. But I was like, yeah, maybe I'll stick him in the live stream. That seems right. And then I was like, wait, why would Sephiroth be in the live stream? And then I looked up Sephiroth in the live stream, and tons of people draw him in the live stream. And I mean, he technically gets like attacked by it at the end of the game and stuff. So I was just like, okay, cool. Let's go ahead and do him in the live stream. So that's how we ended up with this. You can see really quickly there that I tried a bunch of different shine styles for his hair. There's lots of ways that can be tackled, and this is the one that I ended up going with. So the face and the hair, those were sketched enough, but the body wasn't sketched at all. And Sephiroth, depending on the version that you're going with, is either incredibly detailed from the neck down or not very detailed from the neck down. The reference that I ended up ultimately using for it was actually the original Sephiroth art from Final Fantasy VII. I wasn't going to go with something from like Dissidia or go with something from like Kingdom Hearts where there's more to it. I sort of wanted to do my stylistic interpretation of the core Sephiroth from his original appearance. So that's how you get the choices that I made for his armor and for his coat. So that was me opening a side window on the iPad and looking up Sephiroth and just keeping that art up there while I roughed that in. And then at some point I knew I could just color block it without the reference, but then when I got to like the shoulder pads and stuff, I made sure to get that reference back up, because reference is your friend. I've met so many artists over the years that are against reference, and I get it. I was, like that too at one time, but it's really not a good idea. I mean, there's one thing like referencing a character where you're trying to get something right, but I mean, just like reference in general is super important. There's so much visual information that as artists we completely store and we use it over and over and over again, and we don't need reference for. But even things that you know super well, it never hurts to bring up some reference every now and then and just look at it again and go, oh right, that thing I've been doing for years to try and compensate there, it actually looks like this, so I should draw it like this. And so again, word to the wise, just do it. Get reference going. So you can see there that I'm handling this also in multiple layers. So he's got sort of these sub shoulder pads that are actually tight to his shoulders and go over his chest, and then he has the more floaty pauldron type things that go then over that, and so I kept that all separate. I actually have some weird layers here that aren't normally what I would go with. So like I would usually do like his body, his skin is like on a bottommost layer, and then coat on top of that, and between the coat and his skin there'd be like the belts going across his chest. But I didn't plan this well, and it doesn't really matter. It's just more the way your brain thinks logically. Like the body is in the clothes, so the clothes are on top, and the straps are under the clothes but on the skin, so they go in between. And sometimes you want to keep with those expectations so that you can more naturally go through your process. But I had certain reasons why I had done it the way I did it, and so like his head and his neck body are separate. But then that neck body is on top of the coat in the layer stack, which is kind of weird to deal with, which means then those straps go on top of his skin, which means they're also on top of the coat. So you can't just use the natural layer stack to block stuff or to cover stuff. So that was one of those things where if I were going to do it all over again, I would maybe do that just to clean up the process a little bit. So here I'm following the same process that I did before, where I've got the skin is just painted with a light on it, and then the cast shadows from the coat and the hair are all done with a multiply layer on top of that. So now here we go in and flatten the rest of the hair, or flat the rest of the hair, sorry, not flatten. And sometimes I find that if I force myself to do the parts of the painting that I'm not really interested in doing first, it's good, and I'll focus more on it and I'll get it done. Other times I try to really follow what I'm feeling at the time. Sometimes I just want to do the fun stuff, because if I don't do the fun stuff I won't do anything at all, and then later come back and do the hard stuff. But in this one, the hair, it wasn't so much that it was going to be hard, it's just that it was going to be something I had to like think about, and I was really not in the mood to do it. But I said, no, I'm going to do the hair right and do it first, that way I can just knock it out and then I'll move on to everything else. So that's me doing the hair right now. Now there's a lot of layer shenanigans going on with this hair right now. The hair behind, wow, how do I say this? The hair behind the distant side of his face, so the hair on the left, is on the same layer as the hair that's like the back of his head and the hair that goes behind his coat. And then there's another clump of hair that's on top of all of that, which is the hair that's coming down on top of his collar and on top of his shoulder pad and everything. I gotta say, I'm usually a nut about my layer organization, and in this piece I was not. You can see it right there, the way that I'm painting that hair on the back part, and you can see that front piece of hair covering it up. So that means that at some point I have to compensate for that. Lastly, there's that part of the top of his hair where the actual part in his hair is, that's currently flat, is on yet another layer. So that means right now at this point in this piece, there's a chunk of hair that is the backmost part of his hair. Then there's a layer that is the top back part of his part, and then there's a layer that is the underside of the front plane, and then there's the front plane, and under that front plane there's also that hair on the right. So it's a colossal mess, and it made sense at the time, and I managed it, of course, because the piece got done. But there could have been a million ways to do that better, and I actually don't know why I did it so badly. So I guess a word of warning there, like, just make sure you don't get too overly clever and too overly techniquey with the way you're doing all of your layers. You would much rather have these layers be logical and make sense, because then it's easier to move through them. So that means that the layers that we have for this, we have like a gray midtone, we have a darker shadow layer, then we have a brighter mid-tone, like mid-high layer, and then we have the shine. And that was to keep sort of all of his values for his hair, because he's got this light gray hair localized like in the mid-range, with just the highlight, the shine as the brightest point. And then we've got the cast shadow, which is the multiply layer, driving the darker aspects of it. Now, after I'm done with all of these bigger pieces, I'll add the little strands of hair, sort of the flyaways in places. You can see it already on the front plane that we have there, and then I'll add it eventually to this as well. Not a whole lot to say for this sequence. It's really just me going through and modeling everything out. So you can just sort of watch me going through all of it and just getting all the shapes right and everything. Oh, I should also mention that little bit of darkening that's sort of at the roots of his hair, and there you go, I just put it in there as well. That's not supposed to be shadow. Like, Sephiroth is regularly depicted as having dark roots, so I just wanted to echo that a little bit there. Again, going back to the stylistic decisions, the idea here was to really play with his shapes, but I tried to keep his, and maybe a little bit his rendering, but I tried to keep his core qualities there. One of my favorite exercises to do, which I'm actually going to be doing that very soon, I recently asked everybody on Instagram to suggest character for me to redesign, completely redesign, and I'm about to start working on that very soon. So if any of you have been wondering what happened to that, that's going to be happening soon. But one of my favorite things to do is to take a character and go to like their Wikipedia and just like read the description of them and then redesign a character based on that. So try to ignore the way they look entirely and just say like, oh, this, like in the case of Sephiroth, he's this super soldier who has DNA from an alien, and he is trying to destroy the world and all this kind of shit. That's me completely glossing over, you know, piles of lore. But anyways, and then I could take that and actually try to develop what that means in an isolated context that has nothing to do with the game. I think that's really fun. So that's sort of what I was trying to do here, but instead of doing it from a word description, it was doing it from a, okay, these are the visuals. He's got pauldrons that look like this, and he's got long gray hair, he's got this sinister look, and he's got these blue eyes, and then it's like, okay, take all of that and just put it through my filter, and how does that come out the other end? Now, as far as what's actually happening in the painting right now, we've got the straps being painted, as well as the metal rivets, and then the like soldier symbol thing that's on his belt buckle, which I think has been retconned like a million times, so that I tried to go off of the version that was in the original Tetsuya Nomura version. So that's what's going on here. Okay, now we move on to the pauldrons. These are the, as I said before, the original design of the pauldrons, which are fairly simplistic compared to especially like the Dissidia versions. So, you know, basically trying to get that trim right on the edges so that it's got this rounded like tube trim going around the entire thing, and then capture that plane as best as possible. That is the main form of the shoulder pad, the pauldron and the under shoulder guard. He's got these 3 holes on each shoulder pad, which was done with the circle tool. Now I can't even remember if I had the circle tool yet. Yeah, of course, this is 4.2, so I probably used the circle tool. Or not. I don't know. Point is, use the circle tool. So we did the base flap, we did a mid-tone, we did the reflective shine, and now going in and using a dark color, a black actually with a lowered opacity, to do the shadows. Even though the shadows, up until now, the cast shadows have been done with a separate multiply layer, since this is the same object or same material casting shadow on itself, and this was purely about definition from the pauldron to the under shoulder guard, I didn't want to do it with the shadow methodology that I had been using up until this point. I do end up using that a little bit though to punch up a couple of the cast shadows, like from his collar and from his hair. Also, when I go in and do some touch-ups, I do add a little bit of the reflection of the hair in the shadows that the hair is casting, and just trying to capture some of that material better than I was before. And this is me just adding some extra bounce light from below to try and establish that metally sort of chrome look, the metallic chrome look. The background, that's why you can see me starting to choose what the background is here. I wanted to go with like that stereotypical metal chrome look where it's like reflecting the desert, because I just thought that would really sell the material. But if he's not in that environment, it doesn't really work out. So I eventually start changing that around, which you'll see as it goes. Also, usually when I'm trying to figure out all the reflective surfaces is when I start really thinking about the background. So you'll see me start, after I get this coat done, all these layers are separate on the pauldron still, so I can go back and tweak those, which is what I do. So now we're adding the straps that are part of his coat that loop into his shoulder pads. We have a flat layer, and then we go straight to dark. When I'm dealing with really dark objects like this, I usually don't go sort of like mid, high, higher, and then jump to low like I would on like skin. But when I am doing something like a super dark black coat, I like to pick a really dark mid-tone for the base value, and then I instantly go into trying to define it. Because it's so dark, I want to get that definition in there right away so that I know what I'm working with. And so it's just easier for my brain to go the other way, going darker on a dark thing, as opposed to going lighter on a light thing. Okay, adding a little bit of shine just to get a little bit of dimension here, a very stylized squiggly shine, and then that's really all that I end up doing for the coat, because I mean it's just really dark, it should stay dark. Now I start figuring out the life stream, and then as well as this darkening. There's a bunch of shit sort of jumping all over the place, and what you're seeing here is laying the foundation for the background, then laying that fill light in the bottom, changing the reflection on the pauldrons to green now that he's in a green environment, and using some darkening around his entire form. Testing out, you saw for a second there was some color that jumped into his back hair, and that was testing some atmosphere by throwing some green on that back hair. And at this point now I've decided, okay, let's start jumping into the rim light. Some of the life stream has been defined, and these glows are starting to affect the character and starting to put him in the world. So now let's get some reflection, some rim light on the parts that would some rim lights on the parts that would rim light, in order to try and start selling the material as best as possible. And at times, you know, I do a lot of stylistic lighting as opposed to accurate lighting, but every now and then it's fun to do more accurate lighting to try and really sell your materials, and that's why you see me adding more of a reflective nature to his shoulders there with the life stream reflecting on it. And then there we add some more atmospheric lighting to separate his hair from his face and everything. Get some blooms in, get some extra darkening in. At this point now we've reached sort of the touch-up phase, where I'm going through and just trying to make sure everything is as sound as possible. At the resolution that you're viewing this at, you should be able to see little tweaks jumping all around as I'm trying to figure it out. There's some reflection in the coat coming off of from his skin. And now I tried to push depth of field fairly strongly, so we've got a few layers of blurs that I'm then masking out. So it's like a very blurred image, a slightly blurred image, and the original, and then I'm masking it out so that I can get the right depth out of it. So now we throw in some twinkly little live stream bits, a color layer on top to adjust the entire thing, and some more atmospherics, and ultimately this is the final piece right here. In other videos I've talked about a lot of the final steps and little tweaky things that you can do at the end, and a lot of that is sort of what was done here. So I hope you enjoyed seeing the process for Sephiroth. Here's a bit of a detail shot, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. It does actually help the channel and the viewership grow a bit. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.